North Korean troops have entered the battle for the first time and have been killed in action alongside Russian forces. Ukraine faces a new, grave threat to its survival from uncertainty over continued US support under President-elect Donald Trump. We're in Kharkiv. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. There are two topics we're going to cover today. The first is North Korea's soldiers' involvement in the war, and the second is Donald Trump's election and what that will mean for American support for Ukraine. Both potentially big game-changing issues for this conflict. North Korea first. We understand that between 11 and 12,000 North Korean soldiers have made their way not just into Russian territory, initially into the east, but thousands of them, many thousands of them, have travelled right across the country and are now in Kursk Oblast, where the first of them, according to President Zelensky and Western officials reportedly speaking to the New York Times, the first of these soldiers have engaged in battle against Ukraine soldiers who are occupying that pocket of Kursk, which Ukrainian forces captured during their surprise lightning offensive in August. Now, it's unclear how many of these soldiers have been killed, but according to those officials who spoke to the New York Times, they said that the North Korean soldiers were fighting alongside Russian Marines from the 810th Separate Naval Infantry Brigade. Again, no details on exactly where they were fighting or the nature of those clashes, but significant that they are not only in Russia, they're not only in Kursk, but they are fighting Ukrainian forces. This was predicted, and as some of you have pointed out in the comments, this was perhaps predictable after President Putin visited Pyongyang, the first Russian president to visit North Korea for some 24 years, and he signed that mutual defense agreement with North Korea's President Kim Jong-un, and subsequent to that, unlimited partnership is what Kim Jong-un called it. Russia was effectively invaded. Sovereign Russian soil was captured by Ukraine, and it's that territory at the moment that North Korean soldiers are helping Russia to attempt to defend. But we understand Ukrainian soldiers still hold about 250 square miles at least of Russian territory there. A lot of you have asked the questions about this North Korean involvement, and so we're going to try and answer some of them now while we're on this subject. Can they make a difference? It is one of the main questions. Well, 12,000 soldiers. If we believe the attrition rates that we hear from Western officials and Ukrainian officials about Russian battlefield losses, about 1,000, sometimes more than 1,000 soldiers being killed and maimed every day across the front line, then in one sense, all North Korea has provided is 12 days' supply of troops. Indeed, we understand Russia is recruiting from its own population about 30,000 soldiers a month. So that's a huge supply of soldiers that Russia is producing to the front line. So in that sense, these North Korean soldiers unlikely to make a huge difference, but it is symbolic. It's also potentially just the start of a much larger supply. North Korea has an army of about 1.3 million. It's the fourth largest standing army in the world. So it remains to be seen. At the moment, they don't appear to have made a huge difference. Nonetheless, President Zelensky has said that this is opening us a new chapter in global security. And from Ukraine's point of view, Ukraine now finds itself fighting the armies of two nuclear-armed states, not just Russia, but nuclear-armed North Korea as well. And as we've discussed slightly before, this has a huge potential ripple effect on other countries, not least South Korea, because the relationship between Russia and North Korea, the exchange is of concern to South Korea, because whilst North Korea is giving Russia political support, ammunition and now soldiers, the big question for South Korea is what is Russia giving Pyongyang in exchange? And the big concern is that it's missile technology to further Kim Jong-un's nuclear missile ambition. There's a nuclear power, but he hasn't got yet the missile technology he would want to be able to perhaps launch those warheads as far as he might like, or at least threaten to do so. Some of you have pointed out there is not only that defence pact, which perhaps made this predictable, if not inevitable, there is also a precedent for North Korea and Russia cooperating, and that precedent was set during the Korean War in the 1950s when we saw Soviet Union pilots fighting on behalf of North Korea. And an interesting sort of analogy is that whilst we know the North Koreans sent to Russia now are being dressed up in Russian uniforms, they're being given false papers to disguise them as Russian soldiers from Buryatia, a province just north of Mongolia. In the 1950s, when those Soviet pilots flew MiG-15s on behalf of North Korea, those Russian MiG jets were dressed up with either Chinese or North Korean markings to try and disguise them. And according to the US Air Force Museum, those Russian pilots were also encouraged to try and use North Korean phrases on the radios when they were communicating, although that didn't always work. And it became an open secret during the Korean conflict that Soviet pilots were helping North Korea. Some 70 years later, it appears that favour is being returned. What we've also seen with North Korea is an explosion, with the North Korean deployment, is an explosion, I would suggest, in propaganda and information operations, suggestions of not just huge numbers of North Korean losses, but also videos emerging that may or may not show North Korean prisoners. It's very, very difficult to ascertain the veracity of this sort of information. We know that South Korea said it was going to was considering sending military advisors, interpreters to help Ukraine to glean intelligence about these North Korean troops and from them if and when they were captured. One of the more amusing footnotes, perhaps, is that Gideon Rachman, who's a foreign affairs commentator for the Financial Times, shared a tweet this week where he said a normally reliable source had informed him that this was the first time for many of those North Korean soldiers that they'd had unfettered access to the internet. And he said as a result, they were gorging themselves on pornography. Lots of people have made the point that these soldiers have come from the Hermit Kingdom. They've been sealed up in North Korea with little or no contact with the outside world, perhaps for most of their lives. And in fact, this now presents a huge opportunity for the West, not only to sort of in terms of psychological operations, to try and persuade them to defect, but also if they are captured, to try and glean intelligence about what they know of the armed forces that they serve from inside North Korea. The second thing we'll talk about today is Donald Trump's re-election in the United States and what that means for Ukraine. It is a source of huge concern for Ukraine because despite very warm words from President Zelensky was among the first world leaders to congratulate Donald Trump long before the final results were in. He congratulated Trump on what he called his impressive victory. That masked deep-seated anxiety in Kyiv over what this might mean. And there's a number of reasons for that. So first of all, why is Ukraine worried? Well, Donald Trump has said that he would end the war in a day, and that has fueled fears that he might force Ukraine to capitulate, because essentially the only way he might be able to impose a peace would be to take away what America gives Ukraine, which is the means to fight. And any peace that is forced upon Ukraine would likely be one that suits Russia more than it suits Ukraine. He's also called Vladimir Putin a genius and has reportedly stayed in contact with Vladimir Putin over the last 4 years that he's been out of office, with at least, we understand, 7 phone calls. Now, we think we might know a little bit about what Trump has in mind to try and end the conflict. This has been reported variously, but most recently and in most depth by the Wall Street Journal. Essentially, aides in Donald Trump's camp have suggested he would try and freeze the fighting on the current front lines, establish a large demilitarized zone, continue to arm and support Ukraine in order to deter further Russian aggression, but resist any calls to send American forces into the country to guarantee that peace. His message appears to be very clear that would be Europe's responsibility, perhaps the British, perhaps the Germans, they were named, and also to set a sort of medium-term to long-term timeline for Ukraine to join NATO. 20 years was the timeline that was mentioned. So it appears to be, it's a possible scenario. That's what's been reported. Donald Trump hasn't put his name to that plan at the moment, but that appears to be from sources within his circle about what they might be thinking about Ukraine. And certainly when he came to power last time, he made no secret of wanting to end America's engagements in foreign conflicts, what he saw as expensive, costly conflicts that were costing American lives. That leaves the question for Ukraine and for Ukraine's other allies that were, in the worst case scenario, Donald Trump sort of pull the rug out from underneath Kyiv and to cut US support. What would that mean? Now, some of you suggested in the comments that America's providing 95%, 99% of all the military support for Ukraine. That's not true. And so it's worth us just taking a quick look to understand who is providing what. And I'm using figures here from the Kiel Institute, which is based in Germany. They've been tallying all of the pledges of both military aid and humanitarian assistance, and indeed the costs of dealing with the refugee crisis sparked by Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine almost 1,000 days ago. In total, European countries have pledged around 190 billion euros worth of aid. America has committed about 85 billion euros worth of aid, of which Europe has sort of spent 120. America has spent almost all 85 of that. In terms of military assistance, the figures are slightly more stark. America on its own has spent 57 billion euros on military aid for Ukraine. Now that is included in that previous 85 billion figure I gave you, but just to compare it to other donors, the two closest countries, the US and Germany, have both given about 10 billion euros each in terms of military aid. So, the UK and Germany, 20 billion combined, America almost 60 billion on its own. And it's military aid right now, which is clearly the most important for Ukraine to stay in the fight and to have any chance of reversing Russia's gains or slowing Russia's gains. Because at the moment, Ukraine is facing a crumbling front line in the east. We haven't talked a lot today about what's happening on the front line, but it remains a continuation of what we've discussed before. Ukraine is under immense pressure and it has been forced to cede territory, particularly around Donetsk city, west of Donetsk city, Kharkova, west of Marinka, that Avdiivka to Kharkova front, as Russian forces continue to try and capture Pokrovsk. And in the short term, we understand that President Biden's administration, which will remain in power until January, is doing everything it can to get the remaining allocated US aid out of the door before Donald Trump takes power, to try and put Ukraine in the strongest position. Can Ukraine continue to fight without American support? Well, it would clearly be incredibly difficult. America has provided the lion's share of aid, but Ukraine has said two things. First of all, it will continue to rely on other allies who've continued to provide a lot of support. And those other allies, including the United Kingdom, Germany, and NATO writ more broadly, have tried to, in their words, Trump-proof their supplies. Ukraine has also said that it would continue to fight. The Ukrainians who are fighting this war are fighting a war of survival, and as far as they're concerned, they don't have a choice. If you're watching on YouTube and you've got any questions, please, as always, do ask them in the comments below, and I'll answer as many as I can next time. And if I can't answer them next time, I'll answer them in the comments. I'll get in there myself and answer them. I've answered a lot this week as we've gone through, because a lot of today's presentation was based on your questions from last time. Two quick questions. Do I think the war will end in the next 2 years? I certainly hope so. And I'm going to base this slightly on conversations I've had with a Ukrainian soldier, female Ukrainian drone operator who was visiting London recently, and she just talked about the exhaustion that both sides are feeling, not just the Ukrainians. This was a woman who's incredibly determined, who has fought both before the Russian invasion and then almost every day since. And she was talking about this deep sense of fatigue on both sides, and indeed the struggle that both sides are facing to resource their armies, to sustain this level of attrition and the level of soldiers being killed. And that would suggest that both sides are reaching a point where they're more likely to want to talk. And the final question is, will North Korean troops make a difference? I think we've already addressed that. In the numbers that they've arrived in at the moment, it's mainly symbolic, it's concerning, but it is opening the door to what is potentially much more North Korean support. As I say, if you've got any questions, please ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them next week.